Today we are going to talk about the social and cultural period during the Tudor period. Few social and cultural developments of the Tudor age are so important as the multiplication of books and the spread of literary habits. So we have a huge number of books beginning to appear in the Tudor age. Long a great center of manuscript production, York acquired its first printer in Frederick Fries, who became a free man in 1497 as a bookbinder and stationer, but actually appears as book printer in 1510. We have only 6 books that are certainly known to have been printed in York in the Tudor period. In fact, all these activities concerned with printing, publishing books were dominated by men of foreign antecedents who had to meet strong opposition from native stationers and bookbinders. The book trade itself was restricted by the decline in the demand for York service books after the Henrican changes in religion. As you know that Henry VIII has changed the religion of the country from Catholicism to Protestantism. And here when we are referring to the activities concerned with the printing and the publishing of books, it was mainly by men of foreign antecedents, meaning that they are not British. They are foreigners. So the British stationers and bookbinders were opposing their presence in England. So very little actual printing can in fact have taken place in York between 1520 and final centralization of the craft in London by the Stationers' Charter of 1557. What is the Stationers' Charter of 1557? It is to regulate the various professions associated with the publishing industry, including printers, bookbinders, booksellers, and publishers in England. The next thing we have is education. Though the poverty of the city livings tend to exclude learned parish clergy, some pre-Elizabethan priests had small libraries of service books, scriptural commentaries, sermons, and hagiographical and devotional works. What we mean by hagiographical, meaning writing about the lives of saints. These were enlivened by a few histories and in one case by a copy of Boccaccio in English. So priests had libraries in their houses, containing religious books and history books. The history of education in York outside the 2 present grammar schools has still largely to be written. It is known, for example, that John Fletcher, formerly of St. John's College, was teaching in Bishopville before his appointment in 1564. In 1555, the corporation allowed Robert Morris, chaplain, to have either the chapel or the great chamber on Ausbridge for a school, meaning that the country gives permission to these chaplains to establish schools in their houses. Also, there were teachers of music during the Tudor period. Next point is drama. The early history of the drama in York is not exhausted by the theme of mystery plays. In addition to mystery plays, we have other forms of plays. If you remember, mystery plays are religious plays based on stories from the Bible. Throughout the reign of Elizabeth, the civic records make frequent mention of rewards to dramatic companies. Elizabeth established theaters in order to encourage writers to write plays and have them performed on the stage. On the collapse of the mystery plays, meaning they are beginning to disappear, increasing attention was devoted to the Midsummer Eve show, which began soon after dawn with a review of citizens in their armor, and proceeded later in the day with music and merrymaking. So here, in addition to mystery plays, we have a Midsummer Eve show, which starts after dawn from the beginning of the day, and the audience are citizens wearing armor like a shield, and this procession continues during the day, accompanied by happy celebrations and music. As elsewhere in contemporary Europe, pageantry in general and costume in particular occupied a prominent place in the minds of all orders of society. Pageantry means impressive and colorful ceremonies and people wearing costumes to celebrate. A man's substance, meaning wealth, was judged by the clothes his wife could afford to wear. And when in 1565 the council in the north apportioned military taxation, it officially imposed a certain burden upon those whose wives wore jewelry or gowns of silk and velvet. What does this mean? This means that a person was to pay taxes according to how his wife dressed. If she wore jewelry and silk gowns, this means that her husband is going to pay a lot more money as taxes. Next point, sports. The civic records have references to cockfighting, bear baiting, and bull baiting. What does these sports mean? Cockfighting, we have chickens fighting each other, and we have bear baiting, where you have 2 or 3 dogs attacking a bear and biting him until they kill him. And the same is bull baiting, but instead of the bear we have a bull. Also, in addition to these sports, there were dice, cards, and backgammon. There was also horse race. The first recorded horse race at York was in 1530. And when we have a winner, he gets a silver bell, which he undertakes to return a year later when his horse should compete for it against any challenger. So he keeps the silver bell, and then next year when there is a new competition, he challenges another person. This other person, if he wins, he's going to take that silver bell, and if he doesn't, then the winner is going to keep the silver bell. Society in Tudor England. In the 16th century England, most of the population lived in small villages and made their living from farming. So their main means of living depended on farming. However, towns grew larger and more important. During the 16th century, trade and industry grew rapidly, and England became a more and more commercial country. England now began to depend on commerce instead of farming. Mining of coal, tin, and lead flourished, so did the iron industry. During this period, England became richer and richer. As England grew more and more prosperous, life for the well-off became more and more comfortable. Upper class and middle class people benefited from the growing wealth of the country. However, for the poor in Tudor England, life did not improve. This means that the position of the poor did not improve. They still are poor. For them, life was hard and rough. Meanwhile, in the 15th century, the population of England may have been around 2.5 million. It rose steadily during the 16th century. By 1525, it had risen to around 3 million, and by 1600, it was about 4 million. Division of society into 4 groups. Tudor society was divided into 4 broad groups. At the top were the nobility, who owned large amounts of land. Below them were the gentry and rich merchants. Gentlemen owned large amounts of land, and they were usually educated and had a family coat of arms, meaning something like an army. Most important gentlemen never did any manual work. They didn't work themselves. They had people doing things for them. Below the gentry were the yeomen and craftsmen. Yeomen owned their own land. They could be as wealthy as gentlemen, but they worked alongside their men, meaning that they do jobs themselves. Yeomen and craftsmen were often able to read and write. Below the yeomen were the tenant farmers who rent their land from the rich. There were also wage laborers. They were often illiterate and very poor. In Tudor times, the parish became the basis of local government. The most important person was an appointed magistrate called the Justice of the Peace. Meanwhile, in Tudor times, kings and queens grew stronger. Next point, the poor in Tudor England. In the 16th century, jobs were not always easy to find. In Tudor times, there were thousands of people without jobs wandering around looking for work. There were also disabled beggars. There were also people who pretended to be mad or disabled in order to beg, meaning that they are healthy people, they are normal people, but they show that they are disabled, okay, that they are suffering from a certain disease. Tudor governments tolerated disabled beggars. They bore these beggars, that they did not get angry with them because they are disabled. However, they did not tolerate able-bodied people without jobs wandering from place to place. But they were angry with those normal people that they are wandering, meaning that they are moving from one place to another. So they thought such strong vagabonds without a fixed place in society were a threat to law and order. They were afraid of those normal people who are wandering, who are moving from one place to another. Since the 14th century, there had been laws against vagabonds, but in 1530 a new law was passed. The old and disabled poor were to be given license to beg, which is funny, by the way, to have a license given to someone to beg and wander from place to place and asking people for money. However, anyone roaming without a job was tied to a cart in the nearest market town and whipped till they were bloody. If there's a person who doesn't have a license and is moving from one place to another, they tie him to a cart and he's whipped. He's hit by a whip until he becomes bloody. They were then forced to return to the parish where they had been born or where they had lived for the last 3 years. After being punished for wandering from one place to another, they are to be returned to the parish where they were born or to the place where they had been staying for the last 3 years. A law of 1547 said vagabonds could be made slaves for 2 years. This terrible law was abolished, meaning it was cancelled in 1550. Once again, flogging was made the main punishment for vagrancy. So if you are going to be a vagabond or a vagrant, you are going to be flipped, okay? You are going to be hit or whipped until you became bloody. Punishments in the 16th century. In Tudor times, prison was seldom used as a punishment, meaning that to put you in a prison, this is not the punishment. You just stay in prison until you wait for your trial. Instead, people were held in prison until trial, then the prisoner was given a physical punishment. Tudor punishments were simple but harsh, like flogging. Minor crimes were also punished by the pillory or the stocks, something made of wood, and it looks like the pillory looks like the cross, okay, where you have your head put in a hole and your two hands are tried like Christ, and the stocks where you have your legs tied. More serious crimes were punished by death. Beheading was reserved for the wealthy. and the ordinary people were usually hanged. Why is beheading reserved for the wealthy? In order not to feel much pain, you just cut the head. But hanging is reserved for the ordinary people. And we're going to stop here and continue the next time, inshallah.